Tom was a simple man who had grown up with the land. From the time he was a boy, he knew the smell of freshly cut hay, the sound of cows mooing in the early morning, and the long, tiring days that came with farming. His family had owned the same patch of countryside for generations, and though many people moved to the city in search of easier jobs, Tom never wanted to leave. The farm was his home, and the wide wooden barn with its tall double doors was the heart of his life. Every morning, before the sun had fully risen, Tom would wake up, wash his face in cold water, and step outside to start his day. The air in the countryside was always fresh, filled with the smell of soil, grass, and sometimes manure. To him, even the unpleasant smells were part of the life he loved. The barn was more than just a storage place. It held his tools, his tractor, bales of hay, and most importantly, the big harvester that was essential to his work. Without it, he could not bring in the crops during harvest season. The barn doors were built wide and strong so the harvester could move in and out easily. Tom made sure the entrance was always clear. It was like keeping the heart of his farm open, because once those doors were blocked, his whole routine would fall apart. He often reminded himself that farming was not just about planting seeds, but also about discipline, timing, and being ready for sudden changes like weather shifts. Life in the countryside had its challenges. Some days it was too hot, others too wet. Machines would break down, animals would get sick, and sometimes whole weeks of hard work could be ruined by a storm. But Tom was used to facing such struggles. He had a steady strength, the kind that came from working long hours in the fields, lifting heavy bales, and spending years solving problems on his own. He wasn't a man who liked conflict. If something bothered him, he tried to fix it calmly. If someone irritated him, he preferred to let it pass. But he also had limits, and anyone who pushed too far would learn he could be firm when needed. For many years, the farm was peaceful. His neighbors were other farmers, ordinary people who understood each other's struggles. They shared equipment when needed, traded advice about crops, and often greeted each other with friendly waves. Tom enjoyed this simple community spirit. He never worried about anyone blocking his barn or disturbing his routine. Everyone around him knew how important space and access were for farmers. But things changed when new people started moving into the countryside. Wealthy families who had grown tired of city life bought big houses on the edges of farmland. They liked the view of green fields, the quiet roads, and the open sky, but they didn't always understand how farming life worked. Karen was one of these new neighbors. She moved into a big modern house not far from Tom's farm. The house had tall windows, fancy landscaping, and a shiny driveway that looked more like something from a city magazine than part of the countryside. Karen was proud of her expensive lifestyle. She often wore designer clothes even when going out for a short walk, and she loved showing off her brand new Porsche. The car gleamed under the sun, polished so perfectly that it looked like a mirror. Whenever she drove past the farms, she sped along the narrow roads, as if the countryside was her personal racetrack. At first, Tom didn't pay much attention to her. He believed in letting people live how they wanted. If she wanted to dress fancy in the middle of fields, that was her choice. If she wanted to spend her money on a shiny car, that was her business. Tom kept to himself and focused on his crops and animals. But he could not help noticing the way Karen sometimes looked at the farms around her. It wasn't admiration or respect. It was the kind of look that said she thought her new house and her Porsche made her better than everyone else. Despite this, Tom carried on with his daily routine. He fed his animals, checked his fields, and worked on his machines. Every day he made sure the barn was organized. His harvester stood ready, its large metal parts clean and oiled. He had learned over the years that farming depended on timing. When the crops were ready, there was no waiting. One day too late could mean losing half the harvest. That was why the barn doors were so important to him. They had to stay clear. Even a short delay could cause him big losses. One crisp morning, as Tom stood outside drinking his coffee, he heard the sound of a car engine humming nearby. It was Karen's Porsche, its tires crunching on the gravel road. She pulled up not far from his barn, stopped for a moment, and looked around as if checking the scenery. Tom thought nothing of it at first. But as days went by, she began stopping more often near his property. Sometimes she parked close to the barn, took pictures with her phone, and then drove away. Other times she sat in the car with her sunglasses on, tapping her nails on the steering wheel, as if waiting for someone. Tom found it strange, but he didn't want to cause unnecessary trouble. He thought maybe she was just curious about farm life, or maybe she liked the wide open space near his barn. After all, the countryside was peaceful, and many city people enjoyed sitting in their cars to admire it. But deep inside, Tom also felt a small worry. What if one day she parked too close and he needed to move the harvester? He tried to push the thought aside, but it stayed in the back of his mind. The balance of Tom's quiet farm life and Karen's flashy presence started to clash in small ways. On some mornings, while Tom worked with hay bales, Karen would drive by and honk, not in greeting, but to get him to move his tractor from the road so she could pass quickly. If dust rose from his fields and landed on her car, she gave him sharp looks as if he had insulted her. Still, Tom stayed patient. He reminded himself that arguing with such people rarely solved anything. He believed in keeping calm, focusing on his work, letting others behave how they wanted. But the truth was, Karen's arrival had already disturbed the simple rhythm Tom loved so much. The farm was supposed to be a place where respect and understanding guided daily life. For years, everyone knew that barns, fields, and equipment paths were sacred to farmers. They were not parking spots, not playgrounds, not decoration for city people to admire. They were working spaces, as important as an office desk or a hospital room. Tom hoped Karen would eventually realize this. But for now, he chose silence. Continuing his routine, holding on to the peacefulness he had always valued. At first, Tom thought that Karen's habit of parking her Porsche near his barn was only a small issue. He believed she would soon realize that it was a working farm, not some empty land where she could leave her car whenever she wanted, but as days passed, the small issue began to grow. Karen seemed to enjoy stopping her shiny car right where it caused the most inconvenience. Sometimes she parked close to the barn doors, other times directly in the middle of the path Tom used to bring his tractor through. For a farmer who lived by timing and routine, this started to become a real problem. Tom tried to handle the situation politely. One morning, when Karen left her Porsche sitting almost against the barn doors, Tom walked over and tapped lightly on her window. She lowered it just a little, wearing large sunglasses that hid most of her face. Tom spoke gently. "Excuse me? Miss, I need to keep this entrance clear. My machines have to come through here." Karen gave a small laugh like he was exaggerating. "It'll only be a minute," she said, before rolling the window back up. She stayed there another 20 minutes, scrolling on her phone, while Tom stood waiting with his tractor idling. He didn't like wasting fuel, but he hated wasting time even more. That was the first moment he felt his patience truly tested. Over. The next week, the same scene repeated itself in different forms. Sometimes Karen parked while she made phone calls. Other times she stepped out of the car to take selfies with the barn in the background, posing as though the farm were nothing more than a pretty backdrop for her social media. Tom watched her once from a distance, shaking his head as she leaned against the hood of the Porsche, smiling at her phone while his cows mooed loudly from hunger. He needed to get hay from the barn, but her car stood in the way. He ended up carrying smaller loads by hand, sweating under the sun. Just to avoid another argument, Tom wasn't a man who liked to confront others, but he wasn't weak either. He spoke to Karen again the following day. "I really need you to stop parking here. This is not a safe place for your car, and I can't do my work properly." Karen, standing tall on her expensive heels, gave him a dismissive look. "Just a car," she said lightly. "You can drive around it. Don't farmers always find a way?" Her words stung because they showed she had no respect for his work. Farming wasn't a game of finding a way. It was careful, organized, and often a race against time and nature. Driving around her Porsche was not only difficult but sometimes impossible with the size of his machines. The other neighbors noticed too. One of them, an older farmer named Bill, joked with Tom at the feed store. "Saw you stuck again yesterday." That shiny toy of hers is like a fence across your path. Tom forced a smile, but inside he was growing more and more frustrated. He had always believed that city people moving into the countryside needed time to adjust, but Karen wasn't adjusting at all. Instead, she was making herself the center of attention, and not in a good way. As spring turned to summer, Karen's attitude only grew worse. One hot afternoon, Tom was hauling bales of hay, and Karen pulled up, blocking the barn again. When Tom reminded her politely, she waved a hand and said, "Relax, I'll only be 5 minutes." But 5 minutes stretched into half an hour. The sun was beating down, the animals were restless, and Tom's back ached from waiting. He leaned against his tractor, clenching his fists, but forcing himself to stay calm. He thought of his father's advice. Patience, son. The land teaches patience. But his father had never met someone like Karen. Tom tried to think of solutions. He considered putting up a sign that read "No parking, farm access needed" at all times, but he doubted Karen would respect a sign any more than she respected his words. He thought about building a fence or a gate across the barn path, but that would make his own work harder. Besides, he believed in trust and understanding among neighbors. Putting up barriers felt like admitting defeat. One day Tom caught Karen chatting with another newcomer to the area, a man who admired her Porsche. Tom overheard Karen bragging, "Oh, I just love parking near that old barn. It looks so rustic in pictures, don't you think? People online adore the contrast between my car and that dusty wood." That was when Tom realized the truth. For Karen, the barn wasn't a working place. It was just a backdrop for her to show off her lifestyle. She wasn't careless by accident. She was careless on purpose, because she thought the farm was only scenery for her fancy life. Despite his frustration, Tom kept trying to be polite. He didn't want a war with his neighbor. But each incident chipped away at his patience. One morning, he needed to move his harvester for a quick maintenance check. The machine was huge, and the path had to be completely clear. As he walked to the barn, he saw the familiar flash of Silver Curran's Porsche, gleaming right across the doors again. He stood there for a moment, feeling the heat rise in his chest. He marched up to her door and knocked firmly. Karen opened it, sipping coffee from a travel mug, and smiled lazily. "Morning, farmer," she said. "Lovely day, isn't it?" Tom didn't return her smile. "I need to move my harvester now. You have to move your car." Karen leaned against the doorframe, not moving. "I told you before I'll just be a minute. Why are you always in such a rush?" Tom's voice grew firmer. "Because farming doesn't wait. Rain doesn't wait. Animals don't wait. If you block my barn, I can't work." Instead of apologizing, Karen rolled her eyes. "Honestly, you're so dramatic. It's just a door. Can't you plan better so my car isn't in your way?" Those words struck him hard. It wasn't just a door. It was his livelihood, his entire way of life. To hear her dismiss it so easily showed how little she understood. "Ah!" Tom turned and walked away before he said something he would regret. But inside, a storm was brewing by now. The other neighbors were openly talking about her arrogance. Bill told Tom, "If she keeps it up, you'll have to teach her a lesson." Now, Tom didn't like the idea of revenge or anger, but he couldn't deny that something would have to change. He had been patient, he had been polite, and yet Karen acted as though the farm was her playground. The situation became like a shadow hanging over Tom's daily life. Every morning, as he stepped outside, he wondered, would the barn doors be clear today, or would that shiny Porsche be sitting there again? Each time he saw it, his heart sank, and his respect for Karen fell lower. Farming had always given him peace, a steady rhythm that calmed him. But Karen's actions were disrupting that peace. Replacing it with irritation and stress, Tom still hoped she might one day realize the seriousness of her behavior. Maybe she would understand that blocking a barn was not the same as blocking a driveway in the city. Maybe she would see that her minutes of carelessness cost him hours of hard work. But deep inside, Tom was beginning to sense that the problem was not going away. In fact, it was growing, and sooner or later, something would push him to act. The morning started earlier than usual for Tom. He had been awake since before dawn. Lying in bed and listening to the faint sound of the wind moving through the trees. The weather forecast on the old radio had been clear the night before. Storm was coming. Heavy rain, strong winds, and maybe even hail. For a farmer, those words meant danger. If the crops weren't brought in before the storm, they could be destroyed in a single night. Tom knew he had no time to waste. He dressed quickly, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside. The air was still, but there was a strange heaviness. In it, clouds were already gathering far on the horizon, gray and swollen. He could smell the change in the air, that damp, electric scent that always came before a storm. His heart raced, not from fear, but from urgency. The harvest was ready. The fields were golden, the stalks heavy, and he had to act fast before the sky opened up. His plan was simple. Get the harvester out of the barn. Work through the day without stopping and bring in as much as possible before the first drops fell. He grabbed a quick sip of coffee, barely tasting it, and walked briskly toward the barn. Each step carried a sense of determination. He knew his machines, his land, and his limits. If everything went smoothly, he could save most of the crop. But as he came around the corner and the barn doors came into view, his heart sank. There, gleaming like a silver wall across the entrance, sat Karen's Porsche. Its polished surface reflected the weak morning light, mocking him. For a moment, Tom just stood still, staring at it, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had expected this might happen one day, but he had prayed it would not be today, not on the one morning when time mattered most. He walked quickly toward the house next door, his boots crunching hard against the gravel. He knocked on Karen's door with more force than usual. After a long pause, she appeared, still in her silk robe, holding a mug of coffee as if the world outside was not about to break into chaos. Her expression was calm, almost bored. "Good morning, farmer," she said lightly. Tom didn't bother with pleasantries. "You need to move your car now. Yeah, there's a storm coming and I have to get my harvester out, if those crops don't come. And today, I'll lose them." Karen sipped her coffee slowly, as though his words were nothing urgent. "Oh, relax. You always act like the sky's falling. It's just a bit of rain." Tom's voice rose with frustration. "It's not just rain. This harvest is my living. I warned you before not to block that barn. I don't have time for this today. Please move the car right now." But Karen only shrugged. "Have errands later. I'll move it when I'm ready. You can wait. Surely your little farm can survive a few hours?" The words hit him like stones. His little farm. As if the decades of sweat, sacrifice, and responsibility meant nothing. As if his life's work was just a hobby she could mock. He felt the anger, rising in him, stronger than it ever had before. He stared at her, searching her face for even the smallest sign of understanding, but found none. She turned away, walking back into her house. Leaving him standing on the doorstep with the storm pressing closer every second, Tom walked back to the barn slowly, his boots dragging now, his mind swirling with thoughts. The Porsche gleamed in, the sunlight sitting there like a deliberate insult. He looked at the barn doors behind it, tall and wooden, hiding the machine that could save his harvest if only he could reach it. His jaw tightened as he realized how helpless he was in that moment. His patience had been stretched thin for weeks, but now it snapped. He stood there for a long minute, breathing hard. The sound of distant thunder rolling faintly in the distance. His farm had always been his world. Every animal, every crop, every tool mattered. To see it all threatened, because of one woman's arrogance, was unbearable. He thought of his father's words again, about patience and calm, but those lessons felt far away now. He had already given Karen too many chances, too many polite warnings. And still, she had treated him like a nuisance, like a child throwing tantrums. The urgency of the storm left no room for further waiting. Clouds were moving closer now, darker, heavier, carrying with them the smell of coming rain. He knew he had to act. If Karen wouldn't move the car, then he would move forward. Without her permission? His mind was made up in that moment, not with wild rage, but with the cold, firm resolve of a man who had run out of options. He climbed into the harvester. The familiar machine that had been his partner in countless long harvests. The metal seat creaked under his weight, and the steering wheel felt steady in his hands. He turned the key, and the massive engine roared to life, sending vibrations through the barn floor. The sound was powerful, deep, and commanding. The opposite of the delicate hum of the Porsche's engine. Tom sat there for a second, staring out through the wide front window of the harvester at the shiny car blocking his way. He knew what this meant. Once he moved forward, there would be no turning back. But the thought of his crops, of losing months of work to rain and wind, pushed away any hesitation. He pressed his foot down slowly, and the harvester inched forward, its massive wheels crushing the gravel beneath them. The barn doors creaked open, and daylight flooded in. The Porsche sat there, small and fragile in comparison to the giant machine, moving toward it. Tom's heartbeat was steady now, calmer than it had been all morning. The decision was made, and there was a strange peace in that. The harvester rolled forward, closer and closer, while the storm clouds gathered overhead, darkening the fields around them. In that moment, Tom felt something he hadn't felt in years, a mixture of defiance and freedom. He was no longer the patient man swallowing his anger, no longer the neighbor hoping for understanding. He was a farmer fighting for his land, his work, and his dignity. The shiny car in front of him was not just a vehicle. It was a symbol of arrogance, of disrespect, of everything that had pushed him to the edge. And now, it stood directly in the path of the only thing that mattered, his harvest. The sound of thunder cracked louder, closer now, as if the sky itself was reacting to his decision. The Porsche gleamed one last time under the dim light, but Tom's eyes were fixed on the fields beyond, the golden crops swaying gently in the growing wind. He tightened his grip on the wheel, knowing the breaking point had finally arrived. The harvester rumbled beneath Tom, as if it shared his frustration. The huge engine growled, filling the barn with vibrations that shook the walls. Da-da-da-da-da. He kept his eyes locked on the Porsche gleaming in front of the barn doors. It looked so out of place there, polished and delicate, as if it belonged in some city showroom, rather than blocking the entrance of a working farm. Tom's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. For weeks, he had endured Karen's arrogance, her careless parking, her dismissive words. But today was different. Today, the storm was rolling in, threatening to ruin his entire harvest. Today, patience had run out. The giant wheels of the harvester rolled slowly across the barn floor. With every inch forward, Tom's heart thudded harder. He knew once he reached the Porsche there would be no going back. But he wasn't thinking about the car anymore. He was thinking about his crops, his farm, his family's legacy that rested on those golden fields swaying outside. This wasn't about anger or revenge. It was about survival. He pressed his foot down firmly, and the harvester lurched into the sunlight. The Porsche sat shining in the open, proud and perfect. Its silver paint caught the morning light like a mirror, its sleek curves standing as a symbol of luxury. But against the shadow of the harvester, it looked fragile, small, almost laughable. Tom lined up the massive machine directly behind it. For a moment he paused, letting the engine roar, giving Karen one last chance to hear it and come running. To move her car, but the farmhouse next door remained silent. She wasn't coming. Tom leaned forward and pushed the machine ahead. The first touch was almost gentle, the harvester's front brushing against the Porsche's rear bumper. Then came the sound, a sharp crunch of metal giving way, followed by the screech of paint scraping. Tom didn't flinch. He kept going. The harvester climbed over the back of the Porsche, as easily as a boot crushing a can. The wheels, taller than a man, rolled over the shiny surface, flattening it beneath their unstoppable weight. The sound was deafening. Glass shattered, spraying across the gravel. The roof caved in with a groan of twisting steel. The Porsche, once proud and sleek, crumpled like paper. Every inch forward left it more destroyed, headlights smashed into glittering shards. The hood folded like cardboard, the windshield exploded into dust. Tom's eyes stayed forward, focused not on the destruction, but on the open fields beyond. The harvester moved with steady determination, chewing up the obstacle that had mocked him for so long. From a distance, neighbors began to appear. They had heard the roar of the machine, the thunder of crushing metal. Bill, the old farmer, leaned on his fence, watching wide-eyed. Another neighbor stood at the edge of the road, covering her mouth in shock. They had all seen Karen block the barn before, and now they were witnessing what happened when Tom's patience was finally pushed too far. None of them moved to stop him. They simply watched in silence as the harvester rolled on. The Porsche was no match for the monster machine. Its expensive leather seats, its shiny dashboard, its polished rims all reduced to a flattened wreck. The harvester didn't pause or hesitate. It rolled completely over the car until it was clear of the barn doors, leaving behind a pile of mangled metal and shattered glass, where once there had been a symbol of wealth and pride. Now there was only a ruin lying broken on the gravel. Tom finally stopped the harvester just past the wreck. He turned off the engine, and the sudden silence was heavy, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. He climbed down slowly, his boots crunching on the glass and metal shards. He stood beside the wreck, breathing hard, his face calm but firm. He felt no joy in what he had done, but neither did he feel regret. The Porsche had stood in the way of his work, his survival, and now it was gone. The path was clear, just as it should have been all along. The farmhouse door slammed open then, and Karen came rushing out. She was screaming even before she reached. The barn, her silk robe flew in the wind, her hair messy from just waking, but her voice was sharp, filled with disbelief. "What have you done?" she shrieked. Her eyes fell on the flattened wreck of her Porsche, and she let out a cry that echoed across the fields. "My car. Do you know how much that cost?" Tom stood there silently, watching her rage. She ran to the wreck, touching the twisted metal as if trying to wake it from death. She turned on him then, her face red with fury. "You barbarian, you destroyed it. You'll pay for this, every single penny." Tom's voice was calm, steady, and colder than she had ever heard. "I warned you, again and again, that barn is my livelihood, not your parking lot. I asked you politely, and you ignored me. Today, I had no choice." Karen screamed louder, her words tumbling over each other, threats and insults pouring out like fire. Tom didn't raise his voice. He only pointed toward the dark clouds rolling closer. "You see that storm? That's what I was fighting against. Your car was standing between me and my harvest. And now it's not." The neighbors who had gathered whispered among themselves. Some shook their heads in disbelief at the sight of the crushed Porsche, but others nodded quietly. They had all known Karen's arrogance, had all felt her disdain. Bill finally spoke from his fence. "Reckon he warned you plenty, miss. Farmer's barn door is no place for a toy car." Karen spun toward the neighbors, desperate for support, but most looked away. They weren't going to defend her. They knew Tom respected him. They knew how patient he had been until this breaking point. The storm wind picked up then, bending the tall grass in the fields, carrying the smell of rain. Tom turned back toward his harvester, climbed up, and started the engine again. He didn't say another word to Karen. He drove straight into the fields, the machine roaring with purpose, the golden crop swaying ahead of him. Behind him, the wreck of the Porsche lay silent, Karen screaming over it, but Tom didn't look back. His focus was on the harvest. On saving what mattered, every turn of the harvester through the fields was like a release of his frustration. With each row he cleared, he felt lighter. The storm clouds pressed closer, lightning flashing in the distance, but he worked steadily, his machine devouring the stalks. He thought of how long he had stayed quiet, how many times he had swallowed his anger. Now the silence was over. His actions spoke louder than any words. For hours he worked, ignoring the chaos left behind. Neighbors eventually drifted away, shaking their heads, some smiling faintly at the thought of Karen finally being put in her place. By the time the first drops of rain began to fall, Tom had already saved more than half his harvest. The storm raged through the night, but when morning came, his field stood safe. The The same could not be said for Karen's Porsche, now just a twisted reminder of arrogance crushed under the weight of reality. The storm raged through the night, hammering the countryside with heavy rain and loud cracks of thunder. But inside his small farmhouse, Tom slept soundly for the first time in weeks. He had done what needed to be done. The barn door was clear. His harvester had saved most of the crops, and the golden fields that fed him through the year were safe. Outside, the wreck of Karen's Porsche lay like a broken monument, twisted metal and shattered glass glistening in the morning light when the storm clouds finally drifted away. When Tom stepped out at dawn, the air was damp and cool, carrying the fresh smell of wet earth. His boots sank slightly into the softened ground as he walked toward the barn. He paused for a moment, looking at the flattened Porsche. The once perfect car was now unrecognizable, its shiny silver body reduced to lumps of steel. Across it, pecking at bits of glass. For Tom, it wasn't a triumph to gloat over. It was simply what had to be done. He tipped his hat lower on his brow and turned toward the fields. But peace doesn't last long when people like Karen are involved. By mid-morning, the sound of sirens cut through the calm air. A police car rolled up the gravel road, stopping near the wreck. 2 officers stepped out, followed quickly by Karen, who had clearly been waiting for this moment. Her face was pale but angry, her arms crossed tightly as if she were trying to hold herself together. She pointed at the wreck with dramatic motions, her voice loud enough to carry across the yard. That's what he did. He drove that monster machine over my car, destroyed it completely, like some savage. I demand justice, she shouted, her voice cracking from rage. The officers walked over to Tom, who stood calmly beside the barn, his hands resting on his belt. One of them, a younger officer with sharp eyes, spoke first. "Sir, we've had a complaint. Did you drive your harvester over this vehicle?" Tom nodded once. "Yes, I did." Karen gasped behind them, expecting him to deny it. She shrieked, "You see? He admits it. Arrest him right now. This was a crime, destruction of property." But Tom's voice remained steady, low, and firm. "I asked her many times not to block this barn. I explained that this is my working entrance, and my machines have to come through here. Yesterday a storm was coming. If I didn't get my harvester out, I'd have lost my crops. I knocked on her door, and she refused to move the car. She told me to wait. I couldn't wait." The older officer, who had been listening quietly, raised his eyebrows and glanced at the barn. He had grown up in the countryside himself and understood what it meant to lose a harvest. "Ma'am," he said to Karen, "did you leave your car parked here after being told not to?" Karen's face twisted in disbelief that anyone would question her. "That's not the point. That man crushed my Porsche. It was worth more than his entire farm. He's nothing but a—" The officer cut her off. "Answer the question." Karen's lips tightened. "Yes, but I was going to move it. He didn't have to destroy it." The younger officer scribbled notes while the older one walked slowly around the wreck, examining the twisted mess. Then he turned back to Tom. "You understand? There could be consequences, right? This isn't a small thing." Tom nodded. "I understand. But I also understand my work. Without that harvester, without my fields, I have nothing. She blocked me for weeks. I warned her plenty." For a long moment, the yard was quiet, except for the chirping of wet birds. The neighbors had started to gather again, curious about the police cars. Bill leaned on the fence as always, his eyes bright with interest. Another neighbor, a woman named Claire, stepped forward and spoke clearly. "Officers, I've seen him ask her nicely many times." She laughed in his face. We all did. She thought the barn was her picture backdrop. She had it coming. Karen spun toward the crowd, her voice rising. "You're all against me because I'm different, because I don't live in the dirt like you do." Her words only made the neighbors shake their heads. The officers finally said they would file a report and let the court decide, but there would be no arrest that day. Karen screamed that it was unfair, that justice was blind, that her car was a luxury import worth a fortune. But no one looked at her with sympathy. They saw her for what she was, a woman who had disrespected the land, the work, and the people who lived by it. Over the next weeks, the story spread through the town and even further. At the diner, people laughed and shook their heads. "Did you hear about Tom running over that Porsche with his harvester?" someone would say, and the whole table would chuckle. To the farmers, Tom was a quiet hero, the man who had done what everyone secretly wanted to do when arrogance came stomping into their lives. They respected him not because he destroyed a car, but because he stood up for his work, his dignity, and his way of life. Karen, on the other hand, became the subject of whispers and rolled eyes. She drove around town in a rented car, her pride bruised deeper than her wallet. She tried to sue Tom, of course, but the case wasn't simple. Lawyers argued, witnesses gave statements, and the evidence was clear. She had ignored warnings, disrespected the farm, and blocked essential work. While Tom did have to pay some fines and go through long legal discussions, the punishment was far lighter than Karen hoped for. In the court of public opinion, Tom had already won. For Tom, life slowly returned to normal. He fixed his fences, tended his animals, and brought in the rest of the harvest. The storm had done some damage, but thanks to his harvester, most of his crops were saved. Every time he walked past the barn, he felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that his path was clear now, free from the shiny obstacle that had once mocked him. Sometimes, would see Karen from a distance, her face hard and cold as she avoided looking at him. She had learned a lesson, though whether she admitted it to herself or not, Tom didn't care. He hadn't crushed the Porsche out of spite. He had done it because the land demanded respect, and she had refused to give it. The countryside had its own rules, older than any city law. Respect the land, respect the work, respect the people who live by it. Those who ignored these rules often learned the hard way. Karen's Porsche, once a proud symbol of wealth, was now nothing more than a memory, a story told in every farmhouse and diner across the county. And Tom, the quiet farmer, became a reminder that patience has limits, and when pushed too far, even the calmest man will act with the strength of the earth itself. He never boasted about what he had done. He didn't need to. The wreck spoke louder than words, and the golden fields standing tall after the storm were proof enough. For Tom, that was all that mattered. His harvest was safe, his dignity intact, and his barn door finally clear, as it should always have been.